In the summer of 2000, the quiet wilderness of the Florida Everglades was unsettled by a discovery that would drag buried horrors into the harsh daylight. A concrete bunker had been unearthed without warning, leaving behind only the echoes of children's voices that had been silenced 31 years before. But when Marcus Chen stumbles upon a journal stained with decades of decay, he uncovers a truth so disturbing it would unravel the very fabric of a small town's carefully constructed peace and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. The morning had started like any other. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead as the Florida sun climbed higher, its heat already oppressive at 9 a.m. His excavator operator Jimmy had been working the same patch of swampland for 3 days, clearing cypress stumps and palmetto roots for what would become the Everglades Paradise Resort. The investors from Miami were breathing down Marcus's neck. Groundbreaking was already 2 weeks behind schedule. The steel bucket of the excavator bit deep into the black earth, pulling up another load of mud and rotted vegetation. Jimmy was halfway through dumping it when something caught the light, something that wasn't supposed to be there. "Hold up!" Marcus called, raising his hand. He walked closer to the pile, his work boots squelching in the soft ground. Embedded in the muck was a corner of concrete, smooth and deliberately formed. Not a natural limestone outcrop or some forgotten septic tank. This was too clean, too purposeful. Within an hour, they had uncovered the entire structure. A concrete bunker, roughly 8 feet square, buried 4 feet beneath the surface. The metal hatch on top had rusted through in places, but the thick steel hinges still held. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he stared down at it. In his 15 years of development work, he'd never seen anything like this. Jimmy pried the hatch open with a crowbar. The smell that rose from the darkness below made both men step back. Musty air mixed with something else, something that made Marcus's throat constrict. He clicked on his flashlight and aimed it down into the bunker. Small shoes lined one wall. A backpack with cartoon characters. A journal, its pages yellowed and warped. And scratched into the concrete wall in a child's handwriting were 3 names: Tommy, Sarah, Michael. Marcus Chen had found something that was never meant to be found. The names carved into that concrete wall belonged to children who had laughed and played in the summer heat of 1969, when the world felt both infinite and safe. Tommy Brennan, age 10, with freckles scattered across his nose like paint drops. Sarah Chen, 8 years old, whose black pigtails bounced when she ran. Michael Russo, 9, who collected bottle caps and could whistle louder than any bird in the cypress trees. They had been part of Camp Wildwood's 3rd session, 26 children spending 2 weeks in canvas tents along the banks of Turtle Creek, just 8 miles from the town of Cypress Creek. The camp had operated for 7 summers without incident, a place where city kids could catch fireflies and learn to tie knots, where parents felt comfortable sending their children for adventures they themselves had never experienced. On July 23, 1969, the 3 children volunteered for a nature hike with junior counsellor Danny Morrison. The plan was simple: follow the marked trail to Osprey Point, collect specimens for the camp's nature display, and return before lunch. Morrison carried a canvas bag, a first aid kit, and a thermos of lemonade. The children brought their boundless energy and notebooks to record their discoveries. They never returned. By 2 o'clock, when the lunch bell rang and 3 seats remained empty, Camp Director Bill Hendricks felt the first flutter of concern. By 4, when a search of the immediate trails yielded nothing, that flutter had become a cold weight in his chest. By 6, when the Collier County Sheriff's deputies arrived with bloodhounds, the weight had spread to every adult in camp. The search that followed would become the largest in county history. Over 200 volunteers combed 60 square miles of swampland, following every game trail, checking every hunting cabin, dragging every deep pool. Helicopters circled overhead, while airboats carved white wakes through the endless maze of waterways. For 2 weeks, the sound of voices calling their names echoed across the Everglades. Danny Morrison was found on the second day unconscious and delirious, floating face down in a shallow backwater 3 miles from the trail. He claimed to remember nothing after leaving camp, a head injury, the doctors said. Severe concussion. The canvas bag, the first aid kit and the thermos were never recovered. The 3 children had simply vanished, as if the swamp had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. Detective Sarah Reeves had spent 12 years chasing ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, but the ones that haunted case files marked missing in faded red ink. Her specialty was cold cases, the investigations that other detectives had abandoned to time and bureaucratic indifference. She understood the weight that unsolved disappearances carried, how they followed families like shadows growing longer and darker with each passing year. When the call came from Collier County about the bunker discovery, Sarah was reviewing files in her cramped office in Fort Myers. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Martinez, who had worked the original case as a rookie deputy in 1969. His words carried 3 decades of regret. "We need someone who knows how to work old evidence," he told her. "Someone who understands that these cases never really close until someone closes them." Sarah understood. Her sister Emma had vanished when Sarah was 16, walking to school on a Tuesday morning in October and never arriving. 28 years later, Emma's case file still sat in Sarah's home office, thick with dead leads and false hopes. Every missing child case that crossed her desk carried Emma's face. She arrived in Cypress Creek on a Thursday morning, driving past weathered storefronts and Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oak trees. The town had changed little since 1969, still small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, still isolated enough that secrets could fester in the humid air. Her first stop was the county courthouse, where Eleanor Marsh, the town's head librarian, was waiting with carefully organized boxes of newspaper clippings and local records. Eleanor was a small woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her dress buttoned to the collar despite the July heat. She had been 28 in 1969, she explained, and remembered the search as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. "I've preserved everything," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who had spent decades organizing information. The newspaper articles, the volunteer schedules, even some personal photographs from families who participated in the search. "I always believed someone would return to these files someday." Sarah noticed how Eleanor's thin fingers trembled slightly as she opened the first box, how her eyes lingered on the children's school photographs with an intensity that seemed almost maternal. "Where should we begin?" Eleanor asked. Sarah pulled out her notebook. The hunt for answers could finally begin. The first suspect had been obvious from the beginning. Tommy Briggs, 22 years old, in the summer of 1969, had worked at Camp Wildwood for 3 seasons as a senior counselor. He was popular with the children, always ready with stories around the campfire or games during rest periods. But popularity could mask darker impulses, as Sarah had learned from too many cases. Eleanor spread the personnel files across the library table, her movements precise and methodical. "Tommy was terminated on July 19th, she said, pointing to a handwritten notation in the camp's employment record. 4 days before the children disappeared. The reason for termination was listed as inappropriate conduct with minors." Sarah read the accompanying incident report, written in camp director Bill Hendricks's careful script. Tommy had been discovered in the boys' cabin after lights out, helping 10-year-old Kevin Walsh with what he claimed was a nightmare. Parents had complained. Other counselors had expressed concerns about Tommy's tendency to single out certain children for special attention. He was angry about being fired. Eleanor continued, producing a letter from another box. He sent this to Mr. Hendricks 3 days later. The letter was written in tight, angry handwriting. Tommy denied any wrongdoing and accused Hendricks of destroying his reputation based on lies and gossip. He threatened legal action. More disturbing was the final paragraph. "You have no idea what you've done. Those kids trusted me and now you've poisoned everyone against me." Some people might not forget this kind of betrayal. Sarah photographed each document, noting how Eleanor seemed to know exactly which papers would be most relevant. The woman had clearly spent considerable time organizing these materials, anticipating the questions that would eventually be asked. "Did anyone see Tommy in the area after he was fired?" Sarah asked. Eleanor nodded gravely. "Mrs. Patterson, who owned the general store, said she saw him twice. Once on July 21st, buying camping supplies, rope-canned food matches. Then again on July 24th, the day after the children disappeared. She said he looked like he hadn't slept." The timeline was damning. Tommy Briggs had motive opportunity and a documented history of concerning behaviour with children. The camping supplies suggested premeditation. His presence in town after the disappearance suggested he hadn't fled immediately. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said quietly, reaching into the box once more. "I found this among some donated books last year." She handed Sarah a photograph, Tommy Briggs, with his arm around a young boy at a camp function, both smiling at the camera. But Sarah's attention was drawn to the background where the edge of a concrete structure was barely visible through the trees. The concrete structure in the photograph's background haunted Sarah through a sleepless night. By dawn, she was back at the excavation site with a forensics team and portable lighting equipment. What they discovered in the bunker's depths would reshape everything they thought they knew about the children's final months. The bunker was deeper than initially apparent. Below the main chamber, a narrow ladder led to a second level, divided into 3 small compartments, each barely large enough for a child to lie down. Scratch marks covered the walls, not random gouges, but deliberate tallies carved with fingernails or small stones. Sarah counted them in the first cell, 147 marks, grouped in clusters of 7. 21 weeks. They were kept alive, whispered forensics technician Mike Santos, his voice barely audible in the confined space. The beam of his flashlight revealed more evidence: empty tin cans that had once held food, a makeshift bucket, and fragments of children's clothing arranged almost tenderly on crude shelves carved from the earth. In the second cell, Sarah found something that made her stomach lurch. A child's diary written in pencil that had faded to grey ghosts on water-stained pages. The entries began with hope. "Today the man said he might let us go if we're good." They progressed through fear. "Tommy cries all the time now and Sarah won't eat." The final entries dissolved into barely legible pleas. "Please, somebody find us. Please, we'll be so good, please." The handwriting matched samples from Michael Russo's school records. Above them, Sarah could hear Eleanor Marsh's voice as she provided historical context to the other investigators. The librarian had arrived early, carrying thermoses of coffee and fresh copies of maps she claimed to have found in the town archives. Her dedication to helping was remarkable, Sarah thought, especially for someone with no official connection to law enforcement. "The man who built this was patient," Santos observed, running his gloved hand along the smooth concrete walls. "This took months to construct, maybe years. It's not something you throw together after a moment of rage." Sarah nodded, photographing the tally marks. Each cluster represented a week of children's lives slowly extinguished in darkness. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was methodical, calculated horror that had been planned far in advance. From above, Eleanor's voice drifted down. I found another map that might help identify other possible hiding places. Always helpful, Sarah noted. Always one step ahead, with exactly the right information. Harold Whitman had been drinking the day his daughter Sarah disappeared. That single fact had eaten at him for 31 years, growing like a cancer in his chest until he could barely speak her name without his voice cracking. When Detective Reeves knocked on his door, he looked like a man who had been expecting judgment to arrive for decades. "I should have been there?" he said for the 100th time, leading Sarah into a living room that felt like a shrine. Photographs of his daughter covered every surface: Sarah at her 8th birthday party, Sarah on the first day of school, Sarah waving from the Camp Wildwood bus. "I should have gone on that damn camping trip instead of sending her away while I nursed a hangover." Harold was 68 now, his hair completely grey, and his hands marked with liver spots. In 1969, he had been a different man, a successful insurance agent, recently divorced, struggling to raise his daughter alone. The camping trip had seemed like a blessing. 2 weeks where he could drink away his failures without worrying about setting a bad example. "Tell me about July 23rd, Sarah said gently. Harold's eyes grew distant. "I was supposed to pick her up that weekend. Promised to take her to the county fair. Instead, I was passed out on my couch when Sheriff Coleman called." His voice broke. "She died thinking I didn't care enough to come get her." Eleanor Marsh had provided Harold's employment records from the insurance office, along with a troubling detail: he had been fired 2 weeks after the children's disappearance for erratic behaviour and missing work. The official records showed he had called in sick for 5 consecutive days in early August, claiming grief, but his supervisor had noted suspicious inconsistencies in Harold's explanations. "There's something else," Eleanor had whispered to Sarah earlier, producing a manila folder with obvious reluctance. "I hesitate to share this, but Harold was seen in the swamp area during the search. Multiple witnesses placed him near Turtle Creek, sometimes alone, sometimes agitated. He claimed he was looking for Sarah, but..." She had let the implication hang in the air. Now sitting across from this broken man, Sarah studied his reactions carefully. Harold's grief seemed genuine, but grief could coexist with guilt. Parents had killed their children before then, orchestrated elaborate cover-ups. The timeline fit. Harold had been drinking, perhaps became violent, perhaps took the children to silence witnesses. "Mr. Whitman, did you ever visit the area where your daughter disappeared after July 23rd? Harold's hands clenched into fists. "Every day for months. I walked every inch of that swamp until my feet bled. I thought if I looked hard enough, if I suffered enough, maybe I could bring her back." His suffering appeared real, but so did his opportunity. Eleanor Marsh had transformed the Cypress Creek Library's back room into a makeshift command centre for the investigation. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with coloured pins to indicate search areas from 1969 and potential evidence locations. File boxes lined the floor in perfect order, each labelled in Eleanor's precise handwriting: witness statements, search records, camp personnel, local residents. "I've been the town's unofficial historian for 40 years, Eleanor explained as she guided Sarah through the organised chaos. "When people don't know where to put something important, they bring it to the library. I've preserved materials that even the sheriff's department lost over the years." Sarah was impressed by the woman's dedication. Eleanor had clearly spent countless hours organising these materials, cross-referencing documents, and creating detailed timelines. Her maps of the 1969 swampland were particularly valuable, showing logging roads and hunting camps that no longer existed. "This map should help you understand Harold Whitman's movements during the search," Eleanor said, unrolling a hand-drawn chart. I interviewed several volunteers who remembered seeing him in areas that weren't part of the official search grid. Here, here, and here. Her thin finger traced locations marked in red ink. "You interviewed witnesses yourself?" Sarah asked. "Oh yes, dear. I felt it was important to preserve their memories while they were still alive. So many of the original searchers have passed on, you know." Eleanor's voice carried a note of sadness. "I have transcripts of conversations with over 30 volunteers, including some who never spoke to the police." Sarah noticed that Eleanor's transcripts were remarkably detailed, including specific times, weather conditions, and even descriptions of what people wore. It was the kind of meticulous record-keeping that would make any detective envious. "Mrs. Marsh, these interviews, when did you conduct them?" "I started in 1975, Eleanor replied, pulling out a thick binder. "Every year on the anniversary, I would speak with families and volunteers. I wanted to make sure their memories didn't fade." Eleanor opened the binder to reveal pages of handwritten notes, each entry dated and signed. Sarah scanned several transcripts, noting Eleanor's careful attention to detail. One interview conducted with searcher Robert Mills in 1982 contained a disturbing recollection. Harold Whitman was acting strange that second week. Found him digging near the old cypress grove, said he was looking for clues, but he got real angry when I offered to help. "You have an incredible memory for details," Sarah observed. Eleanor smiled modestly. "When something this terrible happens to your community, you remember everything." The hidden room revealed itself by accident. Sarah was measuring the bunker's dimensions when she noticed a discrepancy. The interior walls were 6 inches shorter than the exterior concrete suggested. Running her hands along the back wall, she found a section that sounded hollow when tapped. Behind a carefully concealed panel lay a chamber that had remained undisturbed for 31 years. The killer's private sanctum was a study in methodical documentation. Photographs lined the walls in chronological order, showing the 3 children's deterioration over time. Not explicit images, but something far more chilling: portraits of psychological breakdown captured with clinical precision. Tommy Brennan's bright smile fading to hollow stares. Sarah Chen's defiant anger slowly replaced by defeated compliance. Michael Russo's curiosity transforming into cowering fear. At the center of the room sat a metal desk with a journal bound in water-stained leather. Sarah opened it with trembling hands, immediately recognizing that this was not the desperate scrawling of a victim, but the careful observations of their captor. Day 12, Subject A, Tommy continues to resist suggestion therapy. Reduced meal portions may accelerate compliance. Subjects B and C show promising signs of adaptation to controlled environment. The entries continued for months, detailing psychological experiments conducted on 3 helpless children. The author documented their responses to various stimuli: isolation, false hope, controlled social interaction, with the detached tone of a researcher studying laboratory animals. Day 89. Separation anxiety test, successful. Subject C, Michael, exhibited severe distress when removed from subjects A and B for 48-hour period. Reunification produced desired emotional dependency. Children now view captor as source of both punishment and comfort. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed each page. This monster had kept detailed records of systematic torture, documenting the children's gradual psychological destruction with scientific precision. Whoever had done this possessed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and unlimited patience for their sick experiments. "Detective Reeves," Eleanor's voice called from above. "I brought some lunch and found additional records you might find helpful." Sarah climbed out of the bunker to find Eleanor waiting with sandwiches and yet another box of perfectly organized documents. The woman's dedication was remarkable, though Sarah wondered how someone without law enforcement training could anticipate investigative needs so precisely. "I found Harold Whitman's psychiatric records," Eleanor said quietly. He was hospitalized briefly in 1970 for what the doctors called a nervous breakdown. The intake notes mention guilt-related psychosis and obsessive thoughts about deceased child. Once again, Eleanor had produced exactly the evidence needed to build the case against Harold. The confrontation with Harold Whitman took place on a sweltering Tuesday morning in his kitchen, where the smell of stale coffee mixed with 31 years of accumulated grief. Sarah had assembled what seemed like overwhelming evidence: his presence in unauthorized search areas, his psychiatric breakdown, his history of alcoholism and erratic behavior following Sarah's disappearance. "Harold, I need you to tell me the truth about what happened in those woods," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. The psychological profile from the bunker suggested someone with deep knowledge of child psychology, someone patient enough to conduct months of systematic torture. Harold's guilt and obsessive behavior fit the pattern perfectly. Harold looked up from his untouched coffee, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "I've been waiting 31 years for someone to ask me that question properly." His voice carried a tremor that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Fear, relief, or something else entirely. "I lied to everyone," he continued. "Sheriff Coleman, the search teams, even myself, for decades. But not about what you think." Sarah leaned forward, her notebook ready. This was the moment when most suspects either broke down completely or tried one final desperate lie. "I was in those woods, just like Eleanor told you. I was digging and searching in places I wasn't supposed to be. But I wasn't burying evidence, I was following someone." Harold's hands shook as he reached into a kitchen drawer, pulling out a manila envelope yellowed with age. "I saw someone the night before the children disappeared. Someone walking toward the swamp with camping equipment at 2 a.m. I was too drunk to think clearly then, but the next day, after Sarah vanished..." He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a figure in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight, carrying what appeared to be supplies toward the tree line. The image was blurry, taken from Harold's kitchen window, but Sarah could make out a slight build and long hair. "I spent months trying to track their movements, following trails, looking for any sign of where they might have taken the children. That's why I was acting strange, why I missed work. I was hunting a killer." Sarah studied the photograph. The figure was too distant to identify, but something about the posture seemed familiar. "Harold, why didn't you tell anyone about this?" His laugh was bitter. "Who would have believed the town drunk? I had no proof, no clear view of their face. And I knew if I was wrong, if I accused the wrong person, I might help the real killer escape justice forever." The alibi Harold provided next was ironclad hospital records showing he'd been in the emergency room getting stitches the night the bunker journal indicated the final experiments had taken place. The hospital records were indisputable. Harold Whitman had been in the emergency room on September 15, 1969, receiving 12 stitches after cutting his hand on a broken bottle. The timestamp on his intake form, 11:47 p.m., coincided exactly with the bunker journal's final entry, the one describing the completion of the behavioral modification protocol that had preceded the children's deaths. Sarah sat in her rental car outside Harold's house, staring at the photograph he had given her. The figure in the distance was small, delicate even. Harold's description came back to her. Long hair, slight build, moving like someone familiar with the terrain. She pulled out her phone and called Eleanor Marsh. "Mrs. Marsh, I need to ask you something. In 1969, how long was your hair?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh my, that's quite specific, dear. Let me think." "I suppose it was much longer then, down to my shoulders, if I remember correctly." "Why do you ask?" Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Just trying to establish some details about potential witnesses. You mentioned you were 28 in 1969. Did you live in the same house you do now? Yes, I've been in the same place for 45 years. Right on Maple Street, with a clear view of the road leading to the swamp. I used to enjoy watching the sunrise from my kitchen window. The same vantage point where Harold had taken his photograph. Sarah drove back to the library, her mind racing through the past week's investigation. Eleanor had been present for every breakthrough, always arriving with precisely the right documents at exactly the right moment. The woman's preserved materials had guided the investigation from Tommy Briggs to Harold Whitman with surgical precision. But there had been other details. Eleanor's transcripts of witness interviews contained information that seemed impossibly specific, exact quotes from 30-year-old conversations, perfect recall of weather conditions, precise descriptions of people's clothing. Details that would fade from normal memory, but might remain vivid for someone who had been there for very different reasons. The library was closed, but Sarah could see lights in the back room where Eleanor had set up her research station. She knocked on the rear entrance, and Eleanor opened the door with her characteristic helpful smile. "Detective Reeves, I was just organizing some additional materials I thought might be helpful. I found the most interesting collection of photographs from the search efforts." Eleanor's desk was covered with black and white images of volunteers combing through the swamp. But Sarah's attention was drawn to something else, a magnifying glass that Eleanor had been using to examine the photographs. Through the lens, Sarah could see a close-up of one particular searcher, a young woman with shoulder-length hair and an expression of intense focus. The same woman who now stood before her 40 years older, but unmistakably the same person. "You were there during the search," Sarah said quietly. "You volunteered." Eleanor's smile never wavered. "Of course, dear. Everyone in town did their part." Sarah pushed the door open silently, stepping into the library's back room. Eleanor sat at her desk, completely absorbed in reading from the journal, her back to the entrance. Scattered across the workspace were items Sarah hadn't seen before, childhood photographs, personal mementos, and what appeared to be detailed architectural drawings of the bunker's construction. Day 148. Subjects show complete psychological dependency. Recommend extending observation period to study long-term effects of controlled isolation. Eleanor's voice carried a note of professional satisfaction as she read. Day 152. Introduction of false rescue scenarios proves effective in maintaining subject compliance while preventing escape attempts. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her weapon as she studied the photographs on Eleanor's desk. Black and white images of a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, standing proudly next to what appeared to be a concrete structure, partially hidden by vegetation. The girl's face was unmistakably Eleanor's, the same sharp cheekbones, the same intense eyes that had seemed so helpful throughout the investigation. But it was the object in the girl's hands that made Sarah's breath catch. A small metal box identical to one found among the children's belongings in the bunker. In the photograph, young Eleanor held it like a treasured possession, her smile containing a disturbing hint of the clinical detachment Sarah had just heard in her voice. "I built my first observation chamber when I was 12, Eleanor said, without turning around, apparently sensing Sarah's presence. Just big enough for rabbits and squirrels at first. Amazing how quickly small creatures adapt to controlled environments when you understand the proper psychological principles." Eleanor slowly swiveled in her chair, her face wearing the same helpful expression she'd maintained throughout the investigation. "I've been waiting for someone competent to arrive, Detective Reeves. The local authorities never would have understood the true scope of my work." The truth crystallized with horrifying clarity. Every document Eleanor had provided, every helpful suggestion, every perfectly timed revelation had been carefully orchestrated to guide the investigation away from her while satisfying Sarah's need for answers. The woman had been playing puppet master from the moment Sarah arrived in Cypress Creek. 40 years of research. Eleanor continued gesturing to the organized files surrounding them. Those 3 children provided invaluable data about human psychological resilience under controlled stress conditions. It would be such a shame for their sacrifice to go unrecognized by someone who could truly appreciate the scientific value of their contribution. Eleanor Marsh rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing harmless. At 68, she was still the slight, unassuming figure Harold Whitman had glimpsed in the moonlight 31 years earlier. But now Sarah could see what had been hidden beneath the helpful librarian's facade, the cold calculation of a predator who had turned an entire town into her hunting ground. "I was 8 when I built my first containment structure," Eleanor said, moving to a filing cabinet with deliberate precision. "Just a wooden crate behind our house, but it taught me valuable lessons about behavioral modification through environmental control." She withdrew a thick folder labelled Research Subjects 1960 to 1999 in her meticulous handwriting. Sarah's hand remained on her weapon, but Eleanor seemed entirely unconcerned by the threat. She opened the folder to reveal dozens of photographs, school pictures, family snapshots, images stolen from parents who had trusted the town librarian with their precious memories. "The beauty of working in a library is that families share everything with you," Eleanor continued. "Children's reading levels, family vacation schedules, which parents work late shifts, which homes have adequate supervision." She turned a page revealing what appeared to be detailed profiles of local families spanning 4 decades. "I helped organize every school reading program, every summer camp registration, every scout troop outing. Parents would tell me things they'd never share with neighbors or even relatives." The scope of Eleanor's operation was staggering. The folder contained surveillance notes on dozens of children, detailed assessments of their psychological profiles, and chillingly clinical evaluations of their suitability for what she termed extended behavioral research. Most entries concluded with brief notations, insufficient isolation opportunity, or subject environment too monitored for extraction. But 3 entries bore different markings. Tommy Brennan, Sarah Chen and Michael Russo had been selected not randomly, but through careful observation of their family situations, their personality types, and their participation in the camp program that would provide the perfect extraction opportunity. "Camp Wildwood was ideal," Eleanor explained, noting Sarah's attention to the highlighted entries. "Isolated location, minimal supervision, and a counselor system that made temporary disappearances easy to orchestrate. I spent 2 summers volunteering there before 1969, studying the routines identifying security weaknesses." Sarah's voice was barely controlled. "You've been doing this for 40 years!" Eleanor's smile contained genuine pride. "The 1969 subjects were my most successful long-term study, but hardly my only research. Shorter-term observations. Weekend experiments. Psychological profiling of potential subjects. My work has contributed immensely to our understanding of human behavioral modification under controlled stress conditions." The folder revealed the truth Sarah had dreaded to discover. Eleanor Marsh had been operating undetected for decades, using her position as the town's trusted librarian to identify, study, and systematically victimize children whose disappearances could be explained away or attributed to other causes. The arrest of Eleanor Marsh sent shockwaves through Cypress Creek that would reverberate for years. When backup units arrived at the library, they found her calmly organizing evidence, not destroying it, but cataloging it with the same meticulous care she had applied to her crimes. Her research files contained documentation of 17 children who had vanished or died under suspicious circumstances across 4 decades, each case carefully studied and analysed, like specimens in a laboratory. The FBI's Behavioural Analysis Unit would later describe Eleanor's operation as one of the most sophisticated serial predator cases in American criminal history. She had used her position as town librarian to create detailed psychological profiles of potential victims, timing their disappearances to coincide with natural explanations, runaways, accidents, family relocations that went wrong. Only Tommy, Sarah and Michael had been kept alive long enough to provide the extended research data she craved. She turned the entire community into her laboratory, FBI profiler James Wong explained to the packed courthouse during Eleanor's sentencing hearing. Every conversation with a parent, every story time with children, every helpful suggestion about family activities was part of her victim selection process. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Eleanor showed no remorse, instead expressing disappointment that her research would go unfinished. She received 17 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Marcus Chen made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. The Everglades Paradise Resort project was cancelled and the land was donated to the county for a different purpose. Where luxury condominiums were supposed to rise, Marcus worked with the victims' families to create the Children's Memorial Garden, a place of remembrance surrounded by cypress trees and native wildflowers. The bunker was sealed and covered, but not before Sarah Chen's parents, Harold Whitman, and the Russo family were able to hold a proper burial service for their children's remains. Tommy, Sarah and Michael were finally laid to rest in Cypress Creek's small cemetery, their headstones reading simply, "Beloved children, never forgotten." As they walked away from the memorial dedication ceremony, Sarah Reeves looked at the garden one last time. Harold Whitman stood beside her no longer, carrying the crushing weight of false guilt that had defined 31 years of his life. "Detective," he said quietly, "do you think they knew someone would eventually find them?" Sarah squeezed his weathered hand. "I think they're finally at peace, and that's what matters now." "The real monsters hide behind familiar faces," Harold observed. "But truth endures," Sarah replied, "and so does justice."
Thank you for listening to Brody's
toward a
Stories.
future they would build
Until
together
we meet
one
again.
day at a time.